Okay, I'm Brin. I'm a writer and curator, and I currently work as the public programs manager at Autodesk PR9 workshop, and it's really cool that some of you have been able to visit our space. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit about background about myself and the program that we work on. So I'll be speaking today with Sherri Wasserman and Georgina Voss, who are 2 out of the 4 folks working on the Situated Systems team. Ingrid Burrington and Deb Chatra are also on the team as well, but they are not here with us today. But we're going to speak a little bit today about the project, and we've divided the presentation today into 3 chunks. So for the first bit, I'll talk a little bit about why we wanted to start a program like this at Autodesk. And for the second, Sherri will speak a little bit about what the project is and how the team has gone about researching their work. And finally, George will speak a little bit about the role of place in this site-based research project. So I'm going to get started by giving you a little bit of background about my role as an Autodesk person. So I don't work on the Situated Systems team, but I'm the lab manager and a co-founder. And so I work as a public programs manager at Pier9. That's what Pier9 looks like from one of those sides. We have a really great workshop. We've got CNC machines, 3D printers, laser cutters, a test kitchen, wood shop, metal shop. It's a pretty awesome facility. So how many of you were here at the festival last year? Cool, okay. So if you were here last year, you might remember that Mohsin Aliari, who is in the audience right there, hi, and I were on a panel last year talking about the Artist in Residence program at Autodesk. And so one of the things that we talked about included Pier9 and our workshop, and how we have this artist in residence program where not everyone identifies as an artist. And subsequently, a lot of the work produced in the program at Pier9 has an emphasis on form and aesthetics, but sometimes there's an aboutness quality that isn't necessarily in all of the work. And that's fine. Autodesk is a design software company, not an art company. But also, both Mohsin and I come from more traditional academic art backgrounds in some ways. And she has an MFA and a strong critical theory background. I have an MA in curating, and I've worked in museums for a really long time. So in a certain sense, the Artist in Residence program wasn't giving us something that we were really hungry for, and that was like a deeper look at critical making, more of an interest in theory and research, kind of this interest in, okay, cool, you're making this interesting or beautiful thing, but why? So pretty much simultaneously and autonomously, my boss, Noah Weinstein, Mohsin, and I pretty much all developed separate but similar visions for a program that would build upon all the success and traction of the AIR program and really support that critical aspect simultaneously. Mohsin came up with a great name for the program, the Experimental Research Lab, and then we got to work designing the program. So it was really important to us that the program included 3 components. That it created a legible public discourse that extended beyond tech. I think it can be really easy to get stuck in jargon and kind of navel-gaziness of technology or a particular discipline. And if you're on the outside of that, it can be really, really easy to feel excluded or completely left out of that. And 2, we wanted the group to produce hybrid research. So not just an architecture project, not just a design project, not just an art project. We wanted to look at one research question from multiple angles. And 3rd, finally, we really wanted a project that really either actively used our workshop or related to our workshop thematically. And so we received a handful of very competitive applications, and we interviewed some folks, and ultimately we found that with their combined expertise in material science, infrastructure, research, design, and critical theory, the Situated Systems teams was the best qualified by far to meet the objectives that we had for the program. And so with the understanding that this was sort of a pilot program and that we'd learn a lot in the process, we decided to get started. And we've definitely learned a lot in that process. So as many of you probably know, the idea of artist residencies in tech companies is nothing new. So this is an example from a project Robert Rauschenberg did called Open Score at Bell Labs. And more historical examples include residencies at Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, and contemporarily,
there are residencies at Facebook, Spotify, Adobe, and so on and so on. And I think depending on the company, these residencies can serve a range of functions, including boosting employee morale, to support local arts infrastructure, decorating an office, to marketing or demonstrating the use of a company's technology or data. And I won't speak very much about the AIR program at Pier 9, but it serves all of those functions in a way that is arguably reciprocal and somewhat just. Artists get to keep their own intellectual property, they receive monthly stipends, and their work gets to live on outside the building. We don't keep it forever. So, including some of the work by Gabe that you see in the lobby right now. So thinking about the function of this new program, the Experimental Research Lab, we had a bunch of hopes. We hoped that we could look more critically and become more involved within the deeply complex conversations surrounding the tech sector's role in the ongoing unsustainability of the Bay Area, and that the interdisciplinary qualities of the research could possibly help Autodesk deal better with the problem of its own interdepartmental silos and product groups. And of course, atmosphere and community is a big part of what we see as our strong suits, and we wanted these teams to embed in our community and affect the ways we think, work, and relate to each other. And we could talk more about what a weird situation all of that makes, all of those desires, all of those expectations, all of those hopes. This idea of situating critical public-facing discourse within a for-profit, publicly traded company. Like, how do you get people to care who don't already care? How do you get people to ask questions and be provocative? How do you acclimate a research team to all the hardware, software, and lunchtime rituals of a space like Pier 9? How do you get away with embarking on a potentially provocative process in one of the largest software companies in the world? George and Sherri might touch on these subjects a little bit, but otherwise I feel that we're so deeply amidst the process that I don't really fully know the answer to these questions. But I'll let Sherri speak to what their work is focused on and the forms it's been taking.
So as Sarah mentioned, George and I are two members of the team. We are also artists and designers, but we also have backgrounds in history and anthropology and engineering. We've worked across academia and government and cultural institutions and industry, and we'll try to give you a little glimpse into the world that we've been forming and finding our way through. So as part of the project, we decided to look at the Bay region as today and yesterday. I saw Megan Preilinger speak earlier in the week, and she said something that really struck me about presentism as a framing. And she said, "I'm against presentism because it tends to deny the possibility of change," which I feel is really at the heart of what we're looking at. We're looking backwards and forwards, and we're attempting to understand and unearth the relationships between the past and the present, particularly of this area. So we came into the project with some initial ideas of what we wanted to look at, particularly the military-industrial complex and its relationship to tech culture in this region, particularly over time, and the relationship of those two to the physical environment of the Bay. We all had a certain amount of familiarity and interest in it, but as we really started to get into what was important to us and what the stories were, and the project began to take shape, we found that tech culture became more of an underlying and inherent thing as we investigated these other three things more specifically. And there were a few themes that we kept coming back to again and again, so we're going to start with a glimpse into those to give you a sense of where we're coming from. So as Deb, our colleague, often says, the tech industry went from an industry of atoms to bits to atoms, particularly in this area, starting with Silicon Valley and hardware, then concentrating considerably on software, is now looking very closely at fabrication and other forms of open source hardware. And we are fundamentally situated within a fabrication facility, so materials are essential to everything that we're doing, particularly in a place that's full of machines. Pier 9 is an amazing intersection of software and machines. But we're not just looking at Autodesk in now. This is a machine from Mare Island, this naval shipyard that George discovered. So we're looking backwards as well. And in looking backwards, memory takes on many, many forms. This is a piece about the history of the waterfront, which is the location of our fellowship, and it's a piece of ephemera in the Preilinger Library. So memory can look like this, but it can also look like this, this is the Alameda Naval Base, a building that shuttered in 1995. But it can also look like this. This is a Nike missile silo in the Headlands that was decommissioned in the 70s, but citizens essentially recreated it. The Parks Department took over the land, but it was former military and enthusiasts who worked to really recreate the site that the Park Department gives tours of, and it's maintained by former military on a day-to-day basis. And former military and enthusiasts also recreated the USS Hornet out on Alameda. These enthusiasts and former commissioned men tell their histories and their own stories, but as they institutionalize the stories of this place, they remind us of the persistent link between the military and tech innovation in the region. And it also reminds us that institutions can look like this. This is a military do not disturb sign on Alameda, which is also a Superfund site. And institutions can look like this. This is a outside space at Pier 9. I kind of love this robot. And we're reminded also by artists such as Andrea Fraser that institutions can look like this. As she says, moving from a substantive understanding of the institution as specific places, organizations, and individuals to a conception of it as a social field, the question of what is inside and what is outside becomes much more complex. And going back to one of the things Sarah said, what does it mean to work within an institution, looking at institutions, both formal and informal, and that's the core to much of our work. So there's so many topics and complexities that in many ways Interim just concentrate on 3 of the core ways that we've begun to look at it. The first one is this conceit of transscalar. We first found this concept through a translation by an author, Scott Slovic, who extended this idea to individuals and narratives. But it's really more of a geographic concept of looking at individual spot, individual place that also then translates to a much more global view. This is another machine that George found that is related to Mare Island. She's been tracking where the machines went after the auction of the machines from the decommissioned military site. And we're looking at military-industrial complex and decommissioned bases in general, but she's actually going to the atomic machine level and tracking where have these been going and what does this mean for maker culture here. Situated knowledges is a term that we borrowed from Donna Haraway's seminal essay of the same name. And we take the conceit of we just live here and try to strike up non-innocent conversations very seriously. We have a zine series that we started that we have some physical copies, but it's also distributed online to view on screen or download and print your own. And we've been talking to people in the area who are concentrating on different aspects of what our research is. The first issue was with Scott Kildall, who is associated with both Pier 9 and Gray Area, with an interview with him by George. It also means taking where we are and looking out into the world. This is a view from the arcade at Pier 9, and so we're really looking at the pier as a view shed to annotate what's within and what's without through different knowledges. So one of the key places we can see actually from Pier 9 is Treasure Island, and a recent visit confirmed our instinct that plywood is the material of choice of decommissioned military bases. And so we use that as inspiration to think of a next generation experimental zine project that we're starting to do, where we're using our unique skills and resources to create this experimental zine, using our skills as material scientists and historians and photographers to laser cut plywood that will become both a bespoke object and also a black and white print zine, and we'll also distribute the laser cut files. By using the material itself as the page, we start to thread the narratives across connected sites, across these decommissioned military bases, all of which have a similar materiality to them. And fundamentally, all of these things are connected. I'm going to end now with some views of some of Ingrid's research that she's been doing about mapping the toxic legacy of the tech industry in Silicon Valley.
Okay, so I'm going to bring this particular part of the talk to a close before we have a discussion, thinking about the very specific aspects of where, in terms of what we're doing. Again, We could have done this, well, possibly not with the kind of support we have, but this kind of research interrogating things like the military-industrial complex, the kind of role of kind of geography, topology in this area, could have been done in an archive to a certain extent. There were kind of certainly enough kind of deep libraries and things we could have pulled on and done kind of a more classical piece of kind of social science or design research, but we're not. We're in Pier 9. So what I want to kind of just quickly go through is some of the ways that that influences what we're doing and some of the questions that that raises for our approach, our outcomes, our engagement as well. Again, as Sarah said, we're fairly mired in the project at the moment, so this is kind of more kind of thinking about where we are now than kind of being able to look back at it, you know, a month later. But yeah, this is kind of the point at which we are now. So as Sherri pointed out, we're in a place with very strong machine presence. You know, there are not only machines here, but very large industrial scale machines. And there's kind of a lot here to chew on about both the history of manufacturing in San Francisco itself, going back to, again, the war efforts, the kind of the large foundries that were present too, and also kind of, again, the nods to kind of what maker culture is when you're thinking about something like a water jet, which is exceptionally dangerous to use and fantastic and wonderful, but requires a huge amount of training as well. What it means to have both these industrial tools and all the supporting parts of a wood shop and a metal shop too. How can you kind of bring these things together and think about both the history of creation and production and fabrication in the Bay Area, looking out from here? And again, there is this kind of this longer history around particularly the military sites around here, but also going down into the kind of the South Bay of thinking what was made, what were the machines that we used to kind of make these things, what was the labor that was involved in this engagement, who were the people who were there as well, how, you know, the heft of these things too. So the kind of the machine presence is kind of quite a constant thing for us. Kind of we have, for those of you who've been to Pier 9, you have the workshop at the end of the pier as well. You go through kind of the badged gates to get there. You have to have training to work in these things. So this isn't something that's kind of quite light and quite present. This is something that's kind of very there, very solidly. There's kind of the noise and the sound and the smell of resins and wood and metal that you get there. But thinking about what do these things mean, but how do we work with them? There's a space of Pier 9 itself. Pier 9 is on Embarcadero. It was set up as kind of a showcase for the future of design. So it's a space not only where you have working teams who are kind of developing software, developing strategy, you have the working kind of the machine shop as well, which is a space also for prototyping, for R&D, not necessarily for a production line, but also it's a very publicly facing space. There's a lot of tours that come through, a lot of kind of people that come through this space in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen elsewhere. And that kind of, is encouraging for us to think about kind of what stories get told, what do people see, what do they not see when they come through these spaces, how do they see, the artists, how do they see us, kind of what is the kind of the public vision that gets laid on this place, and what do we think about if we think about what the future of design looks like for this. Again, this huge, wonderful windows that are kind of in there, and the kind of the constant thing that we've had here has been this kind of this looking out of what can you actually see, what's kind of there at this point of of sight here, and what's it mean to kind of bring that back into the workshop too. I mean, it's unsurprising again for the Bay Area, but a lot of the kind of thinking we started with was the water infrastructure of this area, how that relates to military concepts such as shipyards, how this relates to kind of water and groundwater pollution in Superfund sites, how that relates to the kind of the supply chains of the things we can literally see from the Port of Oakland, what was the labor that was involved in building the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate, and what's it mean, for these things to be here as well. One of the first things we did, I think about a week after we hit the ground, was to go up to the Bay model and kind of see this huge, enormous, spectacular, very physical landscape that had been built at a point when software wasn't really useful enough to be doing that kind of modeling, and just seeing both the scale of the kind of the water infrastructure around this area, but also kind of the types of kind of workarounds and hacks that had been built to allow things like container ships to come in. You can see there one of the pilot ships where they steer container ships through the bay towards the port. But this very human hand that maintains itself in this kind of very large complex system itself. And there's a looking back as well. This was from a ferry that was taken down to Oakland from Pier 9 one night. And we're in Embarcadero, we're in the bay, we're in a place where there's a lot of footfall, there's a lot of people. We're not in an industrial park, we're not down in the South Bay, we're not somewhere that you either have to kind of live nearby or commute in. We're somewhere comparatively for the city very, very central. So kind of what that means in terms of who can engage with the technologies there, the kind of the public-facing aspect of it as well, but also kind of the history that comes with being so physically located centrally. I hadn't realized that the screen was going to be so big when I made this slide. but we're going to work with it. This is me, this is me, and this is me, and a gigantic robot arm from one of the labs. So there's kind of a bunch of things going on here beyond base vanity. What do we have in the shops? And what do we have in Pier 9? Well, we have people. We have the shop staff. We have the people who work there. We have the heirs. We have, a huge amount of teams that are there. So when you're thinking about what it means to engage in these kind of corporate, these corporate spaces, these organizations, a la Soylent Green, organizations are made of people. So there's kind of this constant network of knowledge and people that we're engaging with, but also thinking about what their own histories are, what they bring, what their relationship is to the machines that we've got there. This idea of us kind of landing on the ground being like, we're going to tell you about the Bay Area, and they're like, but we work here and we live here, so maybe we can tell you some stuff too. But the other reason for this kind of this machine selfie is, again, there are tours, and there are very lovely machines, and this is not, possibly not this one, but this is not an uncommon thing for people to take a lot of photos of either themselves or with the machines or just the machines themselves. And the machines themselves, and for this audience, I probably don't need to kind of go too much into this, but there's a charisma that comes with machines, particularly large industrial, beautiful laser cutters, the high-end digital fabrication machines, the robot arms, the water jet cutters, even really beautiful lathes, really beautiful drills, really beautiful presses. And that it can create its own kind of intimidation in terms of thinking about how you're going to engage with them, what you're going to make with them, but also, do you just kind of stand back and let them wash over you and make kind of spectacular things, but not actually think about what they're doing? So they can be, they have a presence. I don't want to necessarily anthropomorphize too much to say personality, but there's a definite machine presence which kind of very much presses on kind of how we engage with them, how we work, how we think about the shop, and the relationship that people in Pier 9 and outside of it have when we think about what is a robot arm, what's it to do. But what we don't see as well, there's a lot that we don't see from being here. We're physically on the ground, we're present in Pier 9, but there's a lot that can't be seen. This again is from the Bay model. They're talking here about not only kind of subterranean structures, submerged structures, but also strategy, systems, networks, things that are going on that we can't necessarily see around us when we're in Pier 9 ourselves. These kind of the corporate culture, the kind of things that go on that are kind of beyond our ken, particularly for the time period that we have, but also kind of raising larger questions about what does it mean to be embedded in an organization, but how much can you ever truly know of it? Sherri mentioned Donna Haraway as one of our leading lights for this, and of course, I couldn't go through this without also talking about the kind of work of Bruno Latour around laboratory life, about the different formations of objects and people and things that go to make up a system of science, a system of technology, but again, having to spend time in those spaces to kind of really get a sense of how they reflect and work with us. So to kind of finish for this part of it, that kind of all of this kind of lands in and gives us quite a lot of questions about what we're doing, what we're making, how we're engaging as well, and the kind of critical choices that we're making and how we engage with the machines, how we engage with the peer. It would be, it's kind of, you feel like, I speak for myself, I feel like it would be easy at some stage to just give in to the beauty of the laser cutters and the 3D printers and make something very beautiful. But we have questions to ask here about what are the aesthetic affordances that come with them? What is the meaning to be doing work with resin? Kind of what does it mean to be doing this work in this particular space? In the zine that Sherri mentioned with Scott Kildall, one of the things we talked about there was this idea that if you're working with digital fabrication, particularly in a kind of a critical context, something 3D printed tends to always look 3D printed. So you can't really get away from that aesthetic and that political aspect of what it means to work with these things. When we're thinking about how we can create something that can be replicated, not everyone, very few people are going to have access to the machines that we do. So even if we upload a file at the end of this, you're still going to have infrastructure at the other end to engage with it too. And even thinking about the kind of, like I said, the behaviors, the kind of the systems that Sarah mentioned of the Pier. If you wander around, there's kind of people will have lots of kind of little objects on their desks of things that are digitally fabricated or cut, and particularly the airs. And yet we do this, the kind of the testing thing when you're figuring out how is it going to work or how is it not. And one of the things that we were certainly trying was what happens if the things we make are things that also open up conversations about the project we're doing, as well as allowing us to kind of get our skills set up as well. So this, I think some of you will probably recognize, is the logo, I guess, for San Francisco from 2 centuries ago, which kind of fitted very nicely in our sense of what materials mean in terms of San Francisco's history and its directions too. I'm going to finish up there, but we're going to just continue and come back to, there are big questions here in terms of how this kind of work operates in this type of space, the type of engagement that we're having with the kind of the long history of this particular area. As, you know, particularly as an area that's been through several life cycles. Where we're at now is only one. There's going to be a lot more to come. And what it means for us to be doing this work, and again, for this work to be kind of commissioned in the first place at all. So I think we've got about 20 minutes for discussion, and so I'll come back. Thank you.
So we have questions now. Now we're gonna talk amongst ourselves. So I guess we talked about this a little bit before, but you know, since this is a pilot program, we from the Autodesk side have learned a lot from this kind of experience, and I'm really curious to know, like, what was there anything that surprised you upon coming to Pier 9?
Oh my God.
Or caught you off guard, or something that you weren't expecting?
I mean, I think the thing which is possibly less Pier 9 is more kind of the methods of the techniques we're engaging with, was just the gulf between software and hardware in the machine shop. And I've talked about this, I've ranted about this before, that the machines themselves are not straightforward, but there's a kind of a process with them, a kind of a haptic engagement of how you can kind of deal with them, how you can turn them on, how you can get things to set and so forth, and that's fine. And this is kind of particularly the ones that have a software engaged element where you say upload a file, then you send it in and it does its stuff. The software is the nightmare. The software is a really difficult one. There's kind of, there's a really famous piece of technology anthropology by Julian Orr called, is it Talking About Machines or Talking with Machines, which is this anthropology of photocopier repairmen, where he kind of points out that the way that technology culture operates at Xerox PARC is through discussion, around the coffee table, not through manuals, and that's how people learn. And after kind of just getting furious Illustrator and Photoshop and everything else for I don't know how many times. It's like, well, we need the kind of the updated version of this called swearing at machines. But that kind of gulf between kind of the learning that you have with that kind of space and what you're trying to do with it, I think that caught me off guard a little bit, I think.
I think that's one of the differences between this program, the Experimental Research Lab, and the AIR program, because in the AIR program, we always, at least at this point, after the program's existed for about 3 years, folks who come into the building really have thorough understandings of the software and to an extent the hardware. But that's not why we necessarily wanted to bring your team in. We didn't necessarily want you in here to make objects. So I mean, we're really happy that you were willing to engage with that process.
We have ways that we don't always choose the most efficient ways deliberately. Like, some of us have more software experience than others, but the point has been for everyone to engage with all the pieces. And so sometimes that struggle is part of the point as well, as much as also as we streamline our making as a part of the process, we're going to need to make some of those choices of just efficiency. But efficiency wasn't our first goal. And so that actually ends up bringing these things to light and also bringing up conversations and also putting, like, we have a tech support back channel in our Slack channel wherever, because we're not always in the same place at the same time, whenever people are running into things, they throw questions in so that others can help answer it. So that's part of the collaboration itself, and I think we also all came into it deliberately acknowledging that we wanted to learn from each other, a combination of technical, intellectual, organizational skills. And so, yeah, we have some of it, but we actually deliberately choose to not necessarily go the easiest route, which, given time constraints, sometimes works better than others.
Just thinking about this a bit more, it's possibly not a surprise, but I think the themes that kind of Sherri brought up were kind of ones that emerged over the course of the research. But it's been interesting that I think most of them can be pinpointed, if not to kind of people who are working in Pier 9. Certainly there's been, we've been thinking about them from outside that, but there's always been someone there who's had some kind of like bigger dig into it as well. So again, the work around the decommissioned Mare Island naval ship cards came from some conversations with staff at Pier 9. A lot of the groundwater stuff then led to great discussions with Scott around kind of his water infrastructure artwork as well. So there's been a lot of things that have been, the conversations certainly that Deb's as material scientist has had about what materials mean in a digital fabrication shop in terms of both kind of printing, storing, you know, longer term issues as well. That kind of reflexivity in the discussions has been something that, yeah, I didn't expect at all, but it's been great.
Yeah, I was already looking at Alameda and West Oakland as super fun and like environmental impact sites, and started digging into Treasure Island because of a random conversation with multiple people who, like an artist and also someone else who works at the Pier, were both like, oh, you got to look at this place, and went down a complete other rabbit hole. It's been amazing and inherently connects to everything else. And people have been so generous, even as they're pretty consistent, like, oh, not really sure what you're doing, but it sounds kind of cool. But oh, wait, you're interested in that. Do you know about this? You know, and that in allowing it to be a research project, so it's not like we have to create this one thing by the end. That wandering and allowance for that wandering, and how generous everyone at the Pier has been to send us down many rabbit hole mazes, is not, again, not always efficient, but awesome.
That's something we were really hoping would happen. I think that, you know, yeah, we're providing the hardware and the software and the space, but part of where the magic happens is that sort of deviation from your original project plan and the sort of cross-pollination that happens when you have a whole bunch of different experts working in different fields in the same building. And that's exciting. That's the thing that I feel like would be harder to replicate anywhere else. So I'm really happy that that was something that carried over from the AIR program to your project.
But we didn't know if there were any questions from the audience at all. I think there's a roving mic kicking around somewhere.
But also we can't see you. Okay.
This project to like a 7-year-old, how would you explain it to them?
So definitely, as far as I'm concerned, from an Autodesk perspective, we want that 7-year-old explanation. We were having a meeting yesterday, and we were like, okay, how would you explain it to the CEO of Autodesk? Not necessarily because he is a 7-year-old, but because legibility is really important to me personally as a curator who focuses with public work, but also because not everyone who I report to understands a particular type of language. So I'll let you guys talk about how you're approaching that problem, challenge.
I'm not sure the 7-year-old framing is necessarily works for this particular thing. We are talking about complex research at this stage. We could talk about, and even kind of, I think this comes back to some larger issues about kind of how we talk about politics and culture and economics and even ethics in tech communities themselves. And those are questions that certainly in engineering and design schools, where we're dealing with 18-year-olds to 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds, that's a bigger question of how do you explain the, you know, critical making and culture to an 18-year-old engineering student, let alone a 7-year-old student or a 7-year-old anything, a 7-year-old CEO. Gosh, I think one way to think about it is saying that we're asking a group of people to look at the world that technology lives in, the way that it impacts people, not necessarily the technology itself, but kind of the way that people use it, the way that it's been engaged with, the things that people choose to do with it, and kind of the history that it has. And we're also asking, at the same time, asking that same team to use that technology as a way of talking about it. And you're still maybe getting that up into a 12-year-old stage of understanding at that point, maybe not 7. But I think there is a serious point here about what it means to make complex research legible, and kind of what parts you're kind of chopping off at the same time, or kind of how to frame that specific question to different audiences at the same time. Sherri, I don't know if you've...
Yeah, I think we're all struggling with this, because there's also an inherent tension, I think, in our research and in our team between legibility and research and what that means. Because we do come from such different backgrounds that we speak very well together. Like, I come from a lot of public engagement and exhibit design and like making complex things coherent in a single installation. But I appreciate that my more academic colleagues also come from, well, we start with a general question and we start wandering, and it's not about being able to explain it in a really concise way. And so we've definitely felt that tension, I think, even amongst ourselves. I think fundamentally what we're doing is we are looking at tech culture within the context of the history of this region in its relationship to the military-industrial complex and the physical environment. And that's a highly simplified way of doing it. And we're doing it within, actually making within an institution that is a part of that whole culture and using its tools at its current state to talk about the history and the present and possibly set up some questions for the future. But I just completely made that up. And and every day it's like, okay, wait, crap, we gotta, how do we explain this more succinctly, because then that doesn't go into the million rabbit holes that we all got really excited about and the million stories. So I agree with both George and Sarah about the challenges and the need for both the complexity and the legibility. And I think that's actually inherently one of the most interesting things about being immersed in this project and being allowed to struggle with that. And not being told that it has to. If we can't explain it to a 7-year-old, like, we lose our funding. Yeah, so.
I'm pretty confident that by the end of the project, we're gonna have that explanation. Yeah. I can't see you. Any other questions?
Maybe to extend on that, how do you know when you're done?
Oh, okay. When they're out of time. Okay. So it's a 4-month research project, so they'll be wrapping up in June.
I mean, that's not necessarily done. I mean, so that's kind of where it goes. And that's difficult, right? Because there's that definite point, and this is like, you know this for any kind of research work or any kind of like design work, where everything is interesting at one point, and you're just like, no, you chop that off, and you chop that off, and then we're kind of getting into the workflow, and then we're getting into the design stage, and then like, and there it is, and that's a delivery point. And that kind of, that very hard deadline, whilst it might be looming like a cliff, is also really, really useful just as brutal concentration to kind of think, well, what is the actual thing that we're going to be really talking about at the end of this as well? How everything else can be, you know, again, packaged up and maybe thought about later or given to someone else, and that's fine. But there's going to be that point of that thing is, and that's what we've got then too.
Well, and I think that also opens possibility. We're thinking about outputs of this in ways that allow us to address the complexity, to make elements of it legible without having to make it all monolithic. So whether it's the zine series of talking to different kinds of people, or coming up with this experimental publication model, or objects that we're talking about making, or even we've been talking a lot about riffing off of the fact that there are a gazillion tours at Pier 9, because it's a really neat place, and actually deliberately doing critical tours in the space so that we and collaborators take people through the space with a very specific perspective that is not the one you normally get when you just come as a tourist to the space. And that way, all of those things can kind of coexist. So part of what we're aiming to do is make it more legible, but part of what we're also aiming to do is to create outputs and frameworks that allow us to address the complexity and the fact that this stuff really, there's just way too many stories in some sorts of ways. So how do we open up even more questions as a result of this?
I was going to ask about the outcomes of your research, but I think you may have just answered that. But I guess I would sort of instead ask whether you imagine the intention of your outputs will be to have other people have their own critical investigations, or to consider like some sort of like final creative output that maybe you don't have to see all of the research to experience the final output. Like, I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think right from the very, very beginning, one of the things we were very clear about was that what came out of the end wasn't just going to be some final thing, but there would be resources in some capacity that would allow people to, if not replicate, but kind of riff on what we were doing. There'd be kind of things that could be uploaded, or again, the point I was making about not everyone has access to the, you know, the machines that we do, but what's a kind of a low-res version of that? How can you take an element of that? But also, is again, not necessarily even replicating the research, but how do you use it to kind of to spur those kind of conversations as well? How do you kind of use it as a kind of a starting point to kind of get that line of questioning or kind of, going on in other spaces with what we're doing too? So yeah, right when we were coming together, right when we were pulling together our proposal for the lab, that was kind of really heavily baked in as like, this thing has life beyond the end of the residency itself. This kind of exists in other forms too, because we have the tools to do that as much as anything else.
Yeah, my initial reaction is both. To what you were asking, and that as much as possible, as George says, is distributable, is replicable, and that even things that are, whether it's making our bibliography public, and we're looking at visualizing it in different ways, creating essentially syllabi of some of our research to say, oh, here are really interesting critical projects done in institutions, or here is an interesting reading list on complexity of documentation. But also things like, we do a lot of site visits, and coming up with a methodology inspired by Cornell boxes that we're calling site visit boxes that we're going to do an instructable for and add back into that ecosystem of where even within ourselves, because there's 4 of us, we're trying, and we're all quite different, we're trying to create structures that give a certain amount of consistency but allow for flexibility depending on the topic and the person. And so our intention is to make as much of that as public as possible. So even if people don't necessarily go down the same paths that we have in terms of the research, maybe they learn things they hadn't known otherwise, or maybe they have resources or they have methods that came out of, we're trying to be as transparent as possible as we're doing things, and there will likely be a big critical mass of stuff more towards the end that we release as a part of it.
Hey, so you put up the image of Rauschenberg and Bell Labs, and it definitely took me back to a bit of the feeling of experimentation that came from that period. In a sort of retrospective sense, what do you guys hope people will take away from the work at Pier 9, maybe looking backwards at this specific moment of art and technology?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The perfect for our last question. And so, personally speaking, as someone who's embedded within that company, I think it makes sense, or I hope that people come away with the idea that it doesn't have to be exploitative to work with artists in a corporate context. You can and should pay artists. Artists are really effective in some ways at demonstrating how technological tools can do really cool and interesting things, and that might bring additional perspectives that you wouldn't necessarily get if you have dedicated R&D people working and testing on a particular group of technologies. And also that it's a really effective tool for advertising and marketing. So 90% of Autodesk media mentions come from work created at Pier 9, and I think that's great because it's not like everyone's art projects has like the word Autodesk, 3D printed onto it. They're doing really cool and interesting and meaningful things, in my opinion. And I hope people understand that there are ways that art and creativity and tech and corporate infrastructure can exist simultaneously that isn't completely one way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the smaller things, like looking back on this, one of the things we've always had in mind was this was about processes, about outcomes. So kind of what are we learning from this as, how firstly do interdisciplinary design and research work, and how do you do it in the context of a large software company? But I think there's also there's this kind of quite radical element to this. It's like, this is not the artist in resident program. This is an interdisciplinary, maybe social science, anthropology, design, journalism heavy team that for all the discussions, and I'm aware that I'm saying this here, that we have around art and technology, which are great and really exciting, the elements where we get to bring in those aspects from, say, the social sciences, anthropology, thinking about politics and culture and ethics and even economics, I see those discussions happening less about how you can embed those kind of conversations into technology spaces, whether it's as arts technology spaces, whether it's technology companies, whether it's government itself. So to be able to look back at this as a program, as an instance of thinking about how do you start those, again, coming back to the 7-year-old question, how do you start those quite difficult and complex conversations about difficult and complex aspects of technology within the technology space itself, not from outside of it. And if that's something we get out of it, I'm going to be absolutely stoked.
And I have to say, it is quite meaningful to be able to do this at all, because I think, especially in the United States, there's not the traditional arts infrastructure to support this kind of work with technology necessarily in a very formal way. Great areas here, and that's wonderful. But it means a lot to be able to have art history kind of follow the work, as opposed to the work having to follow art historical precedent in some ways. Sherri, do you have anything? Cool. Well, thanks so much for being a great group.
Thank you.